Hello! Welcome to The Corner Table, a podcast about food and drink in Madison, produced by the Capital Times. Madison's chocolate options are getting better by the year, with new truffle makers and shops showing up all the time. This week on the podcast, I'm talking with Will Marx, the owner of WM Chocolates, who takes cacao beans from places like Ghana, Haiti, and India, and he turns them into these incredible 1 and 2 ounce bars of dark chocolate. I'm your host, Cap Times food writer Lindsay Christians. I am a little bit obsessed with Will's chocolates, so I was really excited to have him on the podcast this week to talk about how he makes the magic happen. Welcome, William.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Lindsay.
So first of all, can you tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm Will, or William. The company is called WM Chocolate, and it's a bean-to-bar chocolate company here in Madison, and it's my full-time job right now, more than full-time a lot of times. And the company is, I'm William. My initials are WM, so that's where the name comes from, and it's something that I started really in my basement, actually. About 3 years ago, I started making chocolate in my basement. So I don't do it in my basement anymore. People will be glad to know. But the name kind of stuck. I used to just stamp it on the packaging to mark it as mine, and the name kind of stuck around. And so when I started the company for real, just under 2 years ago, I kept the name, and I've still been making chocolate. So it's, like I say, coming up on about 3 years now.
When you say bean to bar, what does that mean?
It's almost become like an industry standard phrase for just indicating that you buy the cocoa beans or cacao beans and process from that state to finished chocolate, as opposed to buying chocolate that's already made, like people recognize a chocolate bar, something that looks like that, and melting it down and creating something out of that. So that's the distinction there.
What are the benefits of doing it the way that you do it? Like, why go that far?
A lot of it is a flavor control thing. I mean, certainly texture as well, but it allows you to choose what ingredients you want to use. So for some people, that allows you to have more of a health-conscious approach to chocolate if you want to avoid things like a soy lecithin or other ingredients like that. You can also have control over the roast that you do on the beans, so you can bring out different flavors in the chocolate, which is a really nice thing to be able to do. So it's really kind of a craftsmanship factor more than anything.
You mentioned soy lecithin. What is that? I see that in chocolate a lot.
Yeah.
What does that do?
So what it is, it's an emulsifier. It's not something that you have to add to chocolate to make chocolate work, per se, but what it does is actually a water binder. So water and chocolate are enemies. If you get a little bit of water in your chocolate, it can make the chocolate a lot thicker, which makes it harder for machines to process the chocolate, like to mold it, for example. So manufacturers typically add a lecithin so that their machines can work with a more fluid chocolate more easily. It also allows them to add less cocoa butter to the chocolate. Cocoa butter is really expensive, and so it's a cost-saving opportunity as well.
Do you use it?
No.
Because you don't need to?
You don't need to, no.
So how did you get into making chocolate? Why did you start making chocolate in your basement?
Yeah, well, it becomes kind of a long story. What happened with me was 5 or 6 years ago, I decided to really get off the processed food system and start kind of processing my own food, because I thought that what was available in the grocery stores was often not really what we should be eating, partly for nutritional reasons, partly for reasons of ethics and sustainability. And so I would do things like purchase grain and, mill it in my apartment. I had a little grain mill. I still have it, still use it actually. Or make tortillas from the corn, really from scratch. And in fact, I kind of got off white sugar, so there wasn't really any chocolate that I could find that I wanted to eat. And, after a couple years of not having chocolate, you kind of want some again. And so I started experimenting with, was there a way where I could make chocolate and not have white sugar in it, and use a more, let's say, whole food sweetener like a honey or a whole cane sugar, which is what I came around to using. And the only way to really get that to work and also have it taste good was to start from scratch and do the bean-to-bar thing. There are some tricks you can use to kind of get honey and chocolate and work with cocoa butter and cocoa powder, but the quality is just not really there when you start with those already processed ingredients.
What are some of the challenges of doing it the way that you do? It strikes me that it would be simpler to start with a bar of chocolate and melt it down and do those kinds of things. And you can get like single origin, can't you, of those? But you're doing more steps.
Yeah, I think, part of it is that it was really important to me to have control over the sweetener, and short of buying, basically unsweetened pure baking chocolate and working from that, there was not really a good way to sweeten chocolate without going completely back to the beginning and starting from cocoa beans and grinding the sugar that you want or the sweetener that you want into the chocolate. So that was a big factor. And then I also just found that once I started messing around with this stuff, the flavor was so incredible that, I got better and better at making the flavor incredible. I wanted to keep doing that. I kind of got hooked on these different origins, and frankly, the flavor I was getting out of my basement chocolate making operation was, the best chocolate I've ever had. And I was not about to, once you kind of go into that realm, you can't come back. You couldn't go back to grocery store stuff. So there were other companies that were, making, I think, chocolate of great quality too, but most people don't use sweeteners that I'm down with. So
is roasting chocolate, is roasting the beans like roasting coffee?
It is. It is a lot like roasting coffee. The temperatures involved are a little bit lower, and I think it's a little less fussy, but it is a big control step. And like with coffee, if you want to have brighter, more acidic flavors in your coffee, you're going to do a lighter roast. It's the same kind of thing with chocolate. So you kind of pick a roast profile that suits the cocoa bean or the coffee bean,
What do you tend toward? Are you doing mostly lighter or darker?
I would say what I like to do is see what the bean wants to be. When I start with a new origin, I'll do a couple different roasts, something light, something in the middle, something heavier, and then I just make the chocolate and see what I think is the best expression of the bean. And by best, I think I mean most unique. I want it to taste like something I can remember, so that if you put it in a lineup, I could pick it out. Sometimes that means a lighter roast. A lot of times it does, because a lot of the fruitier flavors that are in some chocolates or some cocoa beans would be driven away by a heavier roast. But there are origins that have a great depth to them, and the deeper you go with the roast, the more you start to bring that depth out. So for those, I'll go heavier.
So give me some examples of some of the chocolates that you're currently making, some of the stuff that's currently in your lineup, and kind of the flavor range of those. So
I think, starting with the kind of the most common flavor, the Ghana bar that I do, it's made with cocoa from Ghana, of course, and West Africa grows most of what we get in our mass market chocolate here. So it's the most familiar flavor profile. It's really chocolatey, really nice and big. And frankly, it's really approachable. So I like to have that in the lineup. But that's one that really benefits from a heavy roast because it just has this kind of endless depth to it. And if you take it light, it's pretty good chocolate, but until you really go part of the world. And it has this kind of amazing acid-driven fruitiness to it, and it's in some ways the backbone is a lot like the Ghana. There's a lot of chocolate there, but if you go light on the roast, you get this really nice, bright kind of grape jelly flavor out of it up front, and then it fades into the nuttier chocolate at the end. So that's one where I decided to do a lighter roast.
So how do you decide on percentage, like how dark you're going to go? How do you set that?
Well, I'd say there are kind of two things going on. One is I have in my mind categories of like sweetness levels that I might be trying to make a bar that fits a certain category. I think 75 is about like the kind of perfect spot for me personally for figuring out what a bean really can taste like. But, if I want to do a 100% bar, then I'm going to find one that I think works at that percentage. If I want to do something a little sweeter as more of a gateway chocolate that might be more approachable, then I'll bump it down into the high 60s. So it's really kind of what product category I'm trying to fit. And then what I'll do is for each bean, they have a certain amount of like natural sweetness or lack of sweetness, let's say. And so I'll kind of adjust up or down. Like the India bar, for example, is a 74%. That's based on the idea, I was going for kind of a standard 75% chocolate flavor, but because it's got a little bit of acid and fruit, it needs a little more sugar to sweeten that up and make it brighter. So that's one where I, bump the sweetness level up a little bit.
Where do you find these beans? Like, how are you sourcing these things?
Yeah, well, it's gotten increasingly complicated over the years. When I started, there's basically one guy who sells small amounts of single origin cocoa beans to regular people like you or me. And he's got a business called Chocolate Alchemy. It's out in Oregon. And so in the beginning, I worked with him. I just order, a pound or two of stuff online. And then as I got bigger, he'll also sell you full, 150-pound sacks of cocoa beans. So I've done some of that with him too. But There are a few specialty cacao suppliers in the country, not a ton, maybe, 2 or 3, who will represent a number of different origins, and then what they do is they'll get the beans across the border, so they're here in the U.S., they don't have to deal with customs and all that kind of stuff. And they'll, make samples available so I can try small amounts of stuff and decide if I want to work with something or not. They're also really nice because they're like-minded in terms of the ethical and sustainable side of things. So I only work with people who I trust.
When I was in New York City about a year ago, I went to a shop that sold only chocolate, salt, and bitters. And I don't remember the name of it.
It's called The Meadow.
The Meadow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was there this summer, too.
Yeah. And it was amazing. And I thought I would take more bitters home if I could put them on the plane. But I got some really interesting chocolate there. I got some Vietnamese chocolate that I'd never had before that then I later saw at Madison Chocolate Company, actually. Is carrying the same producer now. But the first time I saw it was at the Meadow. And it struck, and that chocolate just has a really, really different flavor profile.
Yeah.
It's very different. And so I wonder about that. I mean, you seem to have a lot of interest in these single origin chocolates, and is it because you get that range of flavors, from all of these different locations? Do you think chocolate has terroir, I guess, is the question? Oh,
yeah, I definitely think it does. I mean, I think that it's mostly a plant genetics thing. It's kind of a big debate. It's kind of like nature versus nurture, But I think that the big factor behind flavor and chocolate from different origins is plant genetics, really. But there's also an element of, what the soil is like, what the microclimate is like. Other crops that are growing around it, I think, can influence the flavor as well. But I think it's very real, and I think, to me, I can almost taste more differences in chocolate bars than I can sometimes, say, in wine or coffee. That's partly a bias because of my occupation, but I think it, deserves recognition for having that level of range. I
was surprised to see, I saw you at the holiday market at Amoka, and you had so much variety, more than I thought you made. So how many varieties of chocolate are you currently working with? And you've mentioned a few of them already, like India, and obviously Ghana. What are some of the others that you're working with? What's your range?
So right now I'm working with 6 different origins. I'm doing 7 different bars, and 4 of those bars come in 2 sizes. So the lineup has grown quite a bit. Earlier this year, I was only doing like 3 different origins, 3 different bars. So part of it is just that, I love this stuff and I want to keep adding more. And if I could, I would, work with 20 origins because there are more than 20 that are great out there and you just can't keep up with all of them. But right now I'm doing a Belize origin, and that one's done at 68% dark. So it's my sweetest. It's kind of a gateway chocolate. And for people who like milk chocolate, I usually recommend trying that one. I'm doing the Honduras at 70% with sea salt and also as a 100% bar, which has been interesting to see how people respond to that. It's actually become something that I've gotten a great response to from those who are into that kind of thing. Some people are just totally not going to go that dark, but those who like it seem to really like it.
It can get kind of bitter and dry, I think, at 100%. I don't know what yours is like, but
well, it's not dry. It's still very creamy. It has a nice fudge-like texture, almost like a really rich brownie. It is also, I think it's not particularly dry or crumbly. I often tell people it's not like grocery store baking chocolate. It's not going to have that kind of crumbly bitterness. It's intense. It is intense, but I think people are usually surprised that it's as mild as it is for the percentage. I mean, I'm not going to lie and say it's milk chocolate. It's not, but it's just it's a different animal. But I think it's like having a good cup of black coffee. You can have a really good one or a really bad one. This is a really good one.
And I would argue that it's harder to make a really good cup of black coffee than it is.
Yeah, there's you have nothing to hide behind
exactly
when you go to that level. So same with the chocolate. Yeah.
So you said Honduras.
Yeah, so what else? Then I have the India, which I mentioned, which is done at 74% right now. I've got the Ghana at 75%. The 80% I'm doing right now is an interesting one. It's an 80% made with some Haitian beans that come through Singing Rooster, which is a nonprofit here in Madison that helps connect Haitian artists, farmers, to markets here in the United States. So it's been fun to work with them because usually you're working with people who are on the coast to get these beans because that's where the ports are and that's where the cities are where people buy the stuff. So to have someone in Madison who's doing sourcing is really cool. So that's the 80%. And then I'm doing an 85% with a bean from just across the island from the Haitian origin in the Dominican Republic. And that's it right now.
just that.
Yeah.
Do you find that I guess I'm curious about the feedback you've gotten from some people who are trying some of these. What are the things that surprise them or that they notice?
Yeah, I think, early on it's a lot of the same stuff that I personally noticed when I started making this stuff. A lot of people are surprised that the chocolate is not as bitter as they might think it is for being dark chocolate. Especially, say, like the 70% sea salt bar. I think, that's such an approachable bar, but then you think about it, it's 70% dark chocolate. Like, that's pretty serious stuff. So there's that. I think, again, the texture has been something that I've heard a lot of positive feedback on. People are often surprised that it's smooth, which is like, well, it should be if it's done right. But, it's not always the case. And I think the big thing is some of the fruitier flavors are really surprising to people. If people are up for something different, when I'm sampling, I'll often say, do you want to try something more classic or something surprising? And if they say, okay, I want to do something surprising, then I'll give them the India or the Belize where there's just big pop of fruit flavor in the beginning, and a lot of people are just like totally blown away by the fact that could be in chocolate. So that's really fun to watch people's reactions when they get that, and it kind of never gets old for me to see that.
The way that you're doing chocolate, it reminds me a little bit of the evolution that we've seen, in coffee, right?
Yeah.
But it's so different than like the Fanny Farmer that I went to as a kid. Do you think that chocolate sort of overall is moving in this direction of sort of, being a little bit more focused on sourcing and, the ingredients that are going into the chocolate? Do you see this as a direction that we're moving?
Yeah, I think, I want to hope so because I'm part of it and that's what I believe in. I know that the small kind of artisan or craft chocolate industry, which does care about all those things, is growing, but the future is somewhat uncertain. I mean, there are also huge companies that control most of what happens with cocoa, and I think that, for the most part, it's still about the bottom line there more than, ethical and sustainable sourcing and stuff like that, regardless of what they say. And so it's kind of a battle to be waged, between us small people who are trying to offer something that is truly a different perspective and the bigger companies that are, still trying to bring the cost down as much as possible, which I think has really hurt chocolate because now here we are trying to sell these $8 to $10 chocolate bars and people think we're crazy. How could it be that expensive? Well, it's actually crazy that it was ever as cheap as it has been.
What is the cost of a small bar?
They're usually $5 or $6 for the 1 ounce bars, yeah.
And where can people find?
So in Madison, a lot of specialty stores here carry it. As far as larger grocery stores, the Hy-Vee and Whitney Way does carry my 2 ounce bars. For smaller bars, or actually both size bars, you can go to Underground Butcher, Table Wine, Field Table sometimes stocks them, for Imagination, Forage Kitchen, Porter, the coffee shop off of West Washington. There's probably a couple more. Steve's, all the Steve's wine stores have it.
What does 2018 hold for you?
2018, it should hold some bigger equipment. I'm looking to upgrade things a little bit. It's hard to, you can kind of do a proof of concept at a really small scale, but it's hard to actually make money as a business when you're working with super tiny machines. So I'm working on getting a little bit more production capacity together so I can not be constantly making chocolate myself. I can make a bunch, stop, work on, sales and marketing and all those other things you have to do to have a business, and then go back and make more chocolate when I'm ready to do that. So.
Well, I hope that happens. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Of course, my pleasure.
This has been The Corner Table, a podcast about food and drink in Madison, produced by the Capital Times. Editing for the podcast is done by Eric Lawrenson, and our music was composed by Patrick Christians. You can find more food and drink news at captimes.com. Subscribe to The Corner Table wherever you get your podcasts, and follow us on Facebook at Corner Table Podcast. I'm your host, Cap Times food writer Lindsay Christians. Whether it's bean to bar, single origin, or a Lindt truffle in the checkout line at the grocery store, my wish for you this week is, of course, a delicious piece of chocolate. Cheers!